Sarah Martinez sat quietly in the corner booth of Miller's Coffee House, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. The small town of Riverside had become her sanctuary after 20 years of service, a place where nobody knew her name or her past. She preferred it that way. The simple life of anonymity was something she had earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifices that most people could never imagine. At 38, Sarah looked like any other woman trying to blend into civilian life. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a plain gray sweater. Nothing about her appearance suggested the extraordinary life she had lived. The only hints were subtle, the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, noting exits and potential threats, and the controlled precision with which she moved, even when simply reaching for a coffee cup. Sarah had moved to Riverside 6 months ago after her honorable discharge from the Navy SEALs. 20 years of classified missions, covert operations, and life-or-death situations had taken their toll. She had seen and done things that would haunt most people forever, but she carried those memories with the quiet strength that had made her one of the most respected operators in her unit. Her commanding officers had begged her to reconsider retirement, but Sarah knew it was time. She wanted peace, normalcy, and a chance to discover who she was outside of the military structure that had defined her adult life. The coffee shop had become her morning ritual. She would arrive at 7:30, order the same black coffee, and sit in the same corner booth where she could observe everyone while keeping her back to the wall. It was a habit that would probably never leave her, this constant awareness of her surroundings. The other customers were mostly locals, business people grabbing coffee before work, students from the nearby community college, and retirees who treated the coffee shop like their personal social club. Sarah had deliberately chosen Riverside because it was unremarkable. A small town of about 15,000 people, nestled between rolling hills and farmland, where the biggest news was usually about high school football games or the annual Harvest Festival. It was exactly the opposite of the high-stakes world she had left behind, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death, where she had operated in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Nobody in Riverside knew about her past. When people asked what she did for work, she simply said she was retired military and left it at that. Most people assumed she had been a clerk or maybe military police. The idea that the quiet woman who lived alone in the small house on Elm Street had been part of the most elite fighting force in the world never crossed anyone's mind. Sarah was content to let them think whatever they wanted. She had spent 2 decades being someone else, someone whose very existence was classified. Now, she just wanted to be Sarah Martinez, ordinary citizen. This particular morning started like any other. Sarah was reading a book about gardening, a hobby she was trying to develop as part of her civilian life, when a group of women in their 40s and 50s entered the coffee shop. They were dressed expensively, with designer handbags and perfectly styled hair. Their voices carried across the small space as they discussed their upcoming charity luncheon, their children's achievements, and the latest gossip from their social circle. Sarah recognized them as members of Riverside's social elite. Margaret Thornton, who owned the largest real estate agency in town, was married to a successful lawyer. Jennifer Walsh ran the local art gallery and was known for her elaborate dinner parties. Linda Patterson was married to the bank president and considered herself the unofficial mayor of Riverside's high society. These were women who had never wanted for anything, who lived lives of comfort and privilege, and who had very clear ideas about social hierarchy and who belonged where. As they settled into the large table near the center of the coffee shop, their conversation grew louder. Sarah tried to focus on her book, but their voices were impossible to ignore. They were discussing someone who had apparently offended them at a recent social gathering, dissecting the person's appearance, background, and perceived social status with the casual cruelty that often accompanied privilege. "I just don't understand why people like that think they belong at our events," Margaret was saying, her voice dripping with disdain. "Some people need to learn their place in society." Sarah felt a familiar tension in her shoulders, the same feeling she used to get before a mission when something wasn't right. She had spent her career protecting people, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and there was something about the women's attitude that triggered her protective instincts. But she forced herself to stay calm, to remember that she was no longer responsible for fighting every injustice she encountered. The conversation continued, becoming increasingly nasty as the women fed off each other's negativity. They moved from criticizing one person to another, finding fault with anyone who didn't meet their standards of wealth, appearance, or social standing. Sarah found herself thinking about the men and women she had served with, people who had risked everything for their country, many of whom came from humble backgrounds and would never be accepted by women like these. Then, something happened that changed everything. A young woman named Emma Torres entered the coffee shop. Sarah had seen her before. She was a student at the community college who worked part-time at the local grocery store to pay for her education. Emma was the daughter of immigrants, a first-generation college student who was studying nursing with dreams of helping others. She was exactly the kind of person Sarah had spent her career protecting, someone working hard to build a better life despite facing obstacles that the privileged women at the center table could never understand. Emma approached the counter to order her usual coffee, but the expensive espresso machine chose that moment to malfunction. Coffee began spraying everywhere, and in her nervousness to help the overwhelmed barista, Emma accidentally bumped into Jennifer Walsh, spilling coffee on her designer white blouse. What happened next made Sarah's blood run cold. Instead of accepting Emma's sincere apology and offer to pay for dry cleaning, the three women erupted in fury. They began berating Emma with a viciousness that was completely out of proportion to the accident. They called her clumsy, stupid, and worthless. They suggested that people like her didn't belong in nice establishments and should stick to places more suited to their class. The entire coffee shop fell silent as the verbal assault continued. Emma stood there, tears streaming down her face, apologizing over while the three women showed no mercy. Other customers looked uncomfortable, but did nothing to intervene. The young barista looked horrified, but was too intimidated to speak up against such prominent community members. Sarah felt something snap inside her. These women were using their social position to humiliate a young woman who was working hard to improve her life, someone who represented everything good about the American dream. Emma reminded Sarah of many of the people she had fought to protect over the years. Innocent, hard-working individuals who deserved respect and dignity regardless of their economic status. She's probably here on welfare anyway, Linda Patterson was saying loudly. These people take advantage of hardworking Americans and then can't even handle simple tasks without causing problems. The racist undertones were unmistakable, and Sarah felt the same cold anger she had experienced in combat when facing true evil. She had spent 20 years fighting against people who used power to hurt the innocent, and these women were no different. They might not be carrying weapons, but they were using their social status as a weapon to destroy a young woman's dignity. Emma was now sobbing openly, her dreams of fitting into this community clearly shattered by the cruel words. She reached into her purse with shaking hands, trying to find money to pay for the dry cleaning, but the women weren't interested in any kind of resolution. They were enjoying the power they held over her, the ability to make someone feel small and worthless. Sarah closed her book and stood up slowly. Every person in the coffee shop turned to look at her as she walked calmly toward the confrontation. Her movements were controlled and purposeful with the kind of presence that came from years of command experience. Something in her demeanor caused the three women to pause in their attack, sensing that the dynamic in the room had suddenly shifted. "That's enough," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Margaret Thornton turned toward her with the same arrogance she had been displaying toward Emma. "Excuse me? This is none of your business. We're dealing with someone who clearly doesn't belong here." Sarah stepped closer, positioning herself between the three women and Emma. "She belongs here more than you do," she said, her voice remaining calm, but carrying an edge that made several people in the coffee shop instinctively step back. "And who exactly do you think you are?" Jennifer Walsh demanded, her voice shrill with indignation. "Do you have any idea who we are in this community?" Sarah looked at each of the three women in turn, taking their measure the same way she had evaluated enemies in hostile territory. She saw what she expected to see, people who had lived lives of comfort and entitlement, who had never faced real danger or hardship, who mistook social position for actual strength. "I know exactly what you are," Sarah replied. "You're bullies who think money and social status give you the right to hurt people who can't fight back." The confrontation was escalating, and Sarah could see that the three women were not going to back down easily. They were too accustomed to getting their way, too used to having their social position protect them from consequences. Margaret Thornton's face was red with anger as she prepared to unleash what was clearly going to be a vicious personal attack on Sarah. "Listen here, you nobody," Margaret began, her voice dripping with venom. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is our town. We decide who belongs here and who doesn't. And people like you and her," she gestured dismissively toward Emma, "clearly don't understand your place." Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always come over her in combat situations. Her heart rate slowed, her breathing became controlled, and her mind became laser-focused on the threat in front of her. These women had no idea what they were dealing with, and Sarah realized that her peaceful retirement was about to come to an abrupt end. The coffee shop had become a battlefield, and Sarah Martinez was about to remind everyone present that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost to her own peace and anonymity. Emma Torres stood behind her, still crying, but no longer alone in facing the cruelty of people who believed their privilege made them untouchable. What happened next would change everything for everyone in that small coffee shop, and word would spread throughout Riverside like wildfire. The quiet woman who had been living anonymously among them was about to reveal a strength and background that none of them could have imagined, and the three women who thought their social status made them powerful were about to learn what real power looked like. The tension in Miller's coffee house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret Thornton's face had turned an alarming shade of red as she processed the fact that someone had dared to challenge her authority in public. She was accustomed to people backing down when confronted with her social status and wealth, but the woman standing before her showed no signs of intimidation. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Margaret's voice rose to a near shriek. "I own half the businesses in this town. My husband is the most powerful lawyer in 3 counties. You're making the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. She had faced down terrorists, drug cartels, and enemy soldiers who were far more dangerous than 3 privileged women having a tantrum. The threats and bluster were almost amusing after the life she had lived, but she kept her reaction carefully controlled. "Your threats don't impress me," Sarah said calmly. "What impresses me is young women like Emma who work hard and treat people with respect, not bullies who think money makes them better than everyone else." Jennifer Walsh stepped forward, her designer handbag clutched like a weapon. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. We run this town. We decide who gets jobs, who gets loans, who gets accepted into the right social circles. Cross us, and you'll find out just how small a town Riverside really is." The threat was clear, and Sarah recognized it for what it was, an attempt to use economic and social power to control and intimidate. She had seen similar tactics used by warlords and corrupt officials in various parts of the world. The methods might be different, but the underlying psychology was the same. Use power to hurt those who couldn't fight back. Behind Sarah, Emma Torres had stopped crying and was watching the confrontation with a mixture of fear and amazement. No one had ever stood up for her like this, especially not against people as powerful as the Thornton Walsh Patterson trio. She wanted to tell Sarah to back down, to save herself from the social destruction these women could unleash, but something in Sarah's presence made her believe that maybe, for once, the bullies might not win. Linda Patterson had been unusually quiet during the exchange, but now she stepped forward with a calculating look in her eyes. She had recognized something in Sarah's bearing that the others had missed, a confidence and authority that didn't come from social position or inherited wealth, but from something much deeper and more dangerous. "Wait a minute," Linda said slowly, studying Sarah's face. "I've been trying to figure out where I've seen you before. You're that woman who moved into the Henderson place on Elm Street. The one who pays cash for everything and keeps to herself." Sarah felt a slight chill. She had been careful about maintaining her anonymity, but in a small town, even the most mundane details attracted attention. She had hoped that paying cash and avoiding credit checks would help her stay under the radar, but apparently, it had the opposite effect. "People in this town have been wondering about you," Linda continued, her voice taking on a predatory tone. "A woman living alone, no job anyone knows about, but somehow affording to pay cash for a house and car. No family, no friends, no social connections. It's almost like you're hiding something." The implication was clear, and Sarah could see where this was heading. In small towns, People who didn't fit the normal patterns were often viewed with suspicion. The fact that she kept to herself and paid cash for everything could easily be twisted into something sinister by people who wanted to damage her reputation. Maybe we should ask some questions about how exactly you're supporting yourself, Margaret added, picking up on Linda's line of attack. I know everyone in this town, and nobody knows anything about your background. That seems suspicious to me. Jennifer nodded eagerly. My husband knows people in law enforcement. Maybe it's time someone looked into your situation more closely. People who have nothing to hide don't usually go to such lengths to avoid attention. Sarah realized that the confrontation had reached a tipping point. These women were now actively threatening to use their connections to investigate her background, which could potentially expose details about her military service that were supposed to remain classified. She had hoped to avoid this kind of attention, but Emma Torres' dignity was worth the risk. Go ahead and investigate, Sarah said quietly. But while you're making your phone calls and using your connections to dig into my life, remember that this all started because you decided to humiliate a young woman over an accident. The coffee shop was completely silent now. Every customer and employee was watching the confrontation unfold, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding the full implications. Several people had their phones out, recording the exchange, which meant that word would spread throughout Riverside within hours. Margaret Thornton was now beyond reason. The fact that Sarah wasn't backing down had triggered something primal in her, a need to establish dominance that went beyond rational thought. You're going to regret this, she hissed. By the time we're done with you, you'll wish you had never set foot in this town. I already regret something, Sarah replied. I regret that it took this long for someone to stand up to you. That was the moment when Margaret completely lost control. She stepped forward and, to everyone's shock, raised her hand to slap Sarah across the face. It was a gesture of pure entitlement, the action of someone who had never faced real consequences for their behavior. What happened next was so fast that most people missed it. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Without thinking, she caught Margaret's wrist in midair with a grip that was precise, controlled, and absolutely unbreakable. Margaret's eyes widened in shock and pain as she realized that she couldn't move her arm at all. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sarah said softly, applying just enough pressure to make her point without causing permanent damage. The move was textbook military training, efficient, effective, and designed to neutralize a threat without escalation. Margaret tried to pull her arm free, but Sarah's grip was like iron. The woman who had seemed so ordinary and unremarkable just moments before now displayed a physical capability that was completely unexpected. Margaret's face went from red to pale as she realized that she had seriously misjudged her opponent. Let go of me, Margaret gasped, her voice now showing fear instead of anger. Gladly, Sarah replied, releasing her grip. But keep your hands to yourself. Margaret stumbled backward, cradling her wrist and staring at Sarah with a mixture of shock and growing fear. The casual ease with which Sarah had stopped her attack, the controlled precision of the movement, and the complete lack of emotion in her response all suggested capabilities that went far beyond what anyone would expect from an ordinary civilian. Jennifer Walsh was now looking at Sarah with naked suspicion. What kind of woman moves like that? That wasn't normal. That was trained. Linda Patterson nodded slowly. Military training, but not regular military. I've seen enough soldiers in this town over the years to recognize the difference. This is something else entirely. Sarah realized that her cover was beginning to unravel. The three women were not stupid, despite their behavior, and they had recognized that her physical capabilities were unusual. In a few hours, they would be on the phone with their connections in law enforcement and the military, trying to dig up information about her background. But as she looked at Emma Torres, still standing behind her with tears of gratitude in her eyes, Sarah realized that she didn't regret the choice she had made. She had spent 20 years serving her country in the shadows, protecting people who would never know her name or appreciate her sacrifices. Now, for the first time, she had protected someone who could see and appreciate what she was doing. Emma, Sarah said, turning to the young woman. Are you okay? Emma nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. I've never had anyone stand up for me like that. The moment of tenderness seemed to enrage Margaret even further. This isn't over, she snarled. We're going to find out exactly who you are and what you're hiding. And when we do, you're going to pay for humiliating us. Sarah turned back to face the three women, and for the first time, she allowed a small smile to cross her face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of expression she had worn when facing down much more dangerous enemies in much more hostile territories. "I'm not hiding anything that you need to worry about," she said. "But if you want to start a war over defending a young woman's dignity, that's your choice. Just remember that you started it." The word war hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret, Jennifer, and Linda exchanged glances, each realizing that they had somehow gotten in over their heads. The woman they were facing was not backing down, was not intimidated by their threats, and had just demonstrated physical capabilities that suggested a background far more dangerous than anything they were prepared to deal with. But their pride and social standing were at stake now. They had publicly threatened and been defied, and in a small town like Riverside, that kind of challenge to the established order could not go unanswered. They would have to follow through on their threats, regardless of what they discovered about Sarah's background. As the three women gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, each was already planning their next move. Phone calls would be made, favors would be called in, and by evening, half the town would know that the mysterious woman on Elm Street had made enemies of the most powerful people in Riverside. What none of them realized was that Sarah Martinez had spent 20 years making enemies of some of the most dangerous people in the world, and she was still standing. Three small-town social climbers were not going to present much of a challenge, but their investigation into her background was about to reveal secrets that would change everything about how the town of Riverside viewed both her and themselves. The battle lines had been drawn, and both sides were preparing for a conflict that would expose truths that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. By noon, the entire town of Riverside was buzzing with news about the confrontation at Miller's Coffee House. The story had spread from person to person, growing and changing with each telling, until there were a dozen different versions of what had actually happened. But one thing remained consistent in every account. The mysterious woman who lived on Elm Street had stood up to Margaret Thornton, Jennifer Walsh, and Linda Patterson, and she had done it in a way that left all three women shaken. Margaret Thornton sat in her husband's law office, her wrist still aching from Sarah's grip, while she recounted the morning's events to Robert Thornton. Robert was a successful lawyer who had built his practice on connections, favors, and his wife's social status. He listened to Margaret's story with growing concern, not because he cared about Emma Torres, but because his wife's public humiliation could damage their carefully constructed position in the community. "She's not normal, Robert," Margaret insisted, rubbing her wrist. "The way she moved, the way she grabbed my arm, that was professional training. Military, but not regular military. I've been around enough officers' wives to know the difference." Robert nodded thoughtfully. He had served briefly in the Army Reserve years ago, just long enough to add it to his political resume, and he knew that Margaret's instincts about these things were usually accurate. "I'll make some calls," he said. "Find out what we're dealing with." Meanwhile, Jennifer Walsh was having a similar conversation with her husband, David, who ran the local newspaper. David Walsh had always fancied himself an investigative journalist, though his actual experience was limited to covering high school sports and city council meetings. The prospect of uncovering a real mystery in Riverside was too tempting to resist. "I want you to dig into everything about this woman," Jennifer told him. "Her background, her finances, where she came from, everything. And I want you to make sure the story gets told properly when the truth comes out." Linda Patterson was taking a more direct approach. Her husband, Frank, was the president of Riverside National Bank, and through his connections in the financial community, he had contacts with various law enforcement agencies. Frank made a call to Detective Mike Reynolds, who owed him several favors from previous investigations. "I need you to look into someone for me," Frank told Reynolds. "Woman named Sarah Martinez, lives on Elm Street, pays cash for everything, no credit history we can find, no employment records. Something's not right about her." Detective Reynolds had been a cop for 15 years, and he knew when he was being asked to do someone a favor rather than pursue a legitimate investigation. But Frank Patterson's influence in the community was significant, and Reynolds couldn't afford to make enemies of powerful people. "I'll see what I can find," Reynolds agreed. "But if she's not doing anything illegal, there's only so much I can discover." "Just find out who she really is," Frank replied. "That's all we need." While the investigation was beginning, Sarah was at home in her small house on Elm Street, tending to the garden she had been trying to cultivate as part of her new civilian life. Gardening was supposed to be peaceful, therapeutic, a way to connect with something positive and life-giving after spending so many years focused on destruction and death. But today, she couldn't concentrate on the tomato plants she was trying to stake up properly. She knew that her confrontation with the three women would have consequences. In her military career, she had learned to always think several steps ahead, to anticipate how enemies would respond to her actions. Margaret Thornton, Jennifer Walsh, and Linda Patterson were now her enemies, whether she wanted it or not, and they would use every resource at their disposal to retaliate against her. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah rarely received phone calls, and the number on the display was unfamiliar. She answered cautiously. "Ms. Martinez? This is Detective Mike Reynolds with the Riverside Police Department. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions." Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her. She had been expecting this call. "Of course, Detective. What can I help you with?" "There was an incident at Miller's Coffee House this morning. I understand you were involved in some kind of altercation with 3 local women." "I defended a young student from harassment," Sarah replied simply. "If that's what you're calling an altercation, would you mind if I came by to discuss it in person, just to get your side of the story?" Sarah smiled slightly. She could hear the fishing expedition in his voice, the attempt to gather information under the guise of investigating the coffee shop incident. "Detective, are you investigating an assault? Harassment? What crime exactly are you looking into?" Reynolds paused. "Well, we received some complaints about the incident, and we like to follow up on these things." "I see. And which one of the 3 women filed a complaint? The one who tried to slap me? Because I'm happy to file a complaint about that if you're taking reports." Another pause. Reynolds was clearly not prepared for Sarah to be so direct. Most civilians became nervous when police showed up asking questions, even when they had done nothing wrong. But Sarah's voice remained calm and confident. "Maybe we could just have a brief conversation," Reynolds tried again. "I'm sure we can clear this whole thing up quickly." "Detective, I've been very cooperative so far, but I'm starting to wonder if this is actually about the coffee shop incident at all. If you have specific questions about a crime you're investigating, I'm happy to answer them. If you're just fishing for information about my background on behalf of some influential people, then I think this conversation is over." Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. Sarah's response told him 2 things. First, that she was smart enough to recognize what was really happening, and second, that she wasn't intimidated by police authority. Both of those facts made him more curious about her background, not less. "Ms. Martinez, I'm just trying to do my job here, and I respect that, Detective. But your job is to investigate crimes, not to harass private citizens because they offended someone with connections. If you want to continue this conversation, you're welcome to contact my attorney." "You have an attorney?" "Everyone should have an attorney, Detective, especially when they're being investigated for the crime of defending a young woman from bullies." Sarah hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and concern. She had handled Reynolds properly, but his call confirmed that the 3 women were already using their influence to try to dig into her background. That meant she needed to prepare for the possibility that her military service might be exposed. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Emma Torres knocked on her door, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from the grocery store where she worked. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did today," Emma said when Sarah answered the door. "And I wanted to warn you about something." Sarah invited Emma inside and made tea while the young woman explained what she had learned. "I work at Peterson's grocery, and Mrs. Patterson comes in there all the time. Today she was on the phone with someone, and I heard her talking about you. She was saying that they're going to find out who you really are and make you pay for embarrassing them." Sarah nodded. "I figured they would retaliate. I'm not worried about it." "But you should be," Emma insisted. "These women are really powerful in this town. They can make life very difficult for people they don't like. They got my neighbor fired from her job at the bank just because she disagreed with them about something at a PDA meeting." "Emma, I appreciate your concern, but some things are worth fighting for. Your dignity is one of them." Emma studied Sarah's face, seeing something there that reminded her of her own father, who had served in the military before immigrating to the United States. "You were in the military, weren't you?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "A long time ago. My father was a soldier too, back in El Salvador. He always said you could tell a real warrior by how they protected people who couldn't protect themselves." "That's what you did today." After Emma left, Sarah sat alone in her living room, thinking about the choice she had made that morning. She had spent months building a quiet life in Riverside, staying under the radar and avoiding exactly this kind of attention. But When she saw Emma being humiliated by those three women, all of her instincts as a protector had kicked in. She thought about her years in the SEALs, the missions she had carried out in places where justice was rare, and the powerful preyed on the weak with impunity. She had always fought against that kind of abuse of power, and she wasn't going to stop now just because she was in a small American town instead of foreign war zone. The next morning brought more developments. David Walsh, armed with information from his wife and eager to prove his journalistic skills, had spent the night digging into Sarah's background through public records and online searches. What he found only deepened the mystery. Sarah Martinez had seemingly appeared in Riverside out of nowhere. Her driver's license had been issued 6 months ago, her house purchase had been completed with cash through an attorney, and there was almost no digital footprint for her before her arrival in town. For someone living in the 21st century, it was almost impossible to exist without leaving electronic traces unless you had help making those traces disappear. David was experienced enough to recognize that this level of anonymity required either criminal activity or government involvement. And given Sarah's obvious military training and disciplined behavior, he was leaning toward the government explanation. He began making calls to his contacts in state government and federal agencies, asking about Sarah Martinez and describing the incident at the coffee shop. Most of the calls led nowhere, but one conversation changed everything. When David described Sarah's appearance and behavior to a source in the state attorney general's office, the person on the other end of the line became very quiet. "Did you say Sarah Martinez?" And she demonstrated military-style defensive training. "Yes, why? Do you know something about her?" "I can't discuss specific individuals, but I can tell you that if the woman you're describing is who I think she is, you and your friend have made a very serious mistake." "What do you mean?" "I mean that some people have backgrounds that are classified for very good reasons, and those people don't appreciate having their privacy violated by small-town gossips." The line went dead, leaving David Walsh with more questions than answers, and a growing feeling that he had gotten involved in something much bigger than a simple social dispute. By the end of the second day, word was spreading throughout Riverside that the investigation into Sarah Martinez had taken an unexpected turn. Instead of uncovering evidence of criminal activity or suspicious behavior, the inquiries were running into walls that suggested government involvement and classified information. The three women who had started the investigation were about to learn that sometimes, when you go looking for secrets, you find more than you bargained for. And Sarah Martinez was about to discover that even in retirement, her past had a way of catching up with her. 3 days after the coffee shop confrontation, Detective Mike Reynolds received a phone call that changed everything he thought he knew about the Sarah Martinez investigation. The call came from a number with a Washington, D.C. area code, and the voice on the other end carried the kind of authority that Reynolds had learned to recognize and respect during his years in law enforcement. "Detective Reynolds, this is Commander Patricia Hayes, U.S. Navy Personnel Command. I understand you've been making inquiries about a Ms. Sarah Martinez." Reynolds felt his stomach drop. Federal involvement in what he had thought was a simple small-town dispute meant that he was way out of his depth. "Yes, ma'am. We received some complaints about an incident, and we were just following up." "Detective, I'm going to give you some information that will help you understand the situation you've stumbled into. Sarah Martinez is a retired Navy SEAL with 20 years of distinguished service. Her record is largely classified, but I can tell you that she has served her country with extraordinary courage and distinction in some of the most dangerous places on Earth." The silence that followed was deafening. Reynolds had suspected that Sarah had military training, but Navy SEALs were the elite of the elite. There were fewer than 3,000 active SEALs in the entire Navy, and female SEALs were even rarer. He was suddenly very glad that he hadn't pressed harder during his phone conversation with her. "Now," Commander Hayes continued, "I'm told that Ms. Martinez used minimal force to defend herself when someone attempted to assault her. That hardly seems like something that should concern law enforcement, unless you're planning to arrest the person who tried to hit her." "No, ma'am," Reynolds said quickly. The investigation was more about, well, people had questions about her background. "I see. People with influence who don't like being challenged decided to use law enforcement to harass a decorated veteran. Detective Reynolds, I strongly suggest you close this investigation immediately and advise the complainants that Ms. Martinez has served her country with honor and deserves to be left alone." The call ended, leaving Reynolds staring at his phone and realizing that he needed to have some very uncomfortable conversations with the people who had pressured him into investigating Sarah. The revelation that she was a retired Navy SEAL changed everything about the situation. Meanwhile, David Walsh was having his own revelation. After his mysterious phone call the previous day, he had continued digging into Sarah's background through different channels. What he discovered made him wish he had never started looking in the first place. Through a contact at the Pentagon, David learned that questions about Sarah Martinez were being flagged at the highest levels of military intelligence. Her service record was classified far above the level that a small-town newspaper editor could access, which meant that her missions had involved national security matters of the highest importance. David's contact had been very clear about the implications. David, whoever this woman is, she's not someone you want to cross. The kind of classification levels we're talking about here mean that she was involved in operations that could have changed the course of international events. These are people who have literally saved American lives through their actions, and they're protected by the full weight of the federal government. At the same time, Frank Patterson was learning similar information through his banking connections. When he had asked his law enforcement contacts to look into Sarah's financial background, the inquiry had been noted by federal agencies that monitored potential threats to former special operations personnel. Frank received a visit from two men in dark suits who identified themselves as agents from a federal agency that he had never heard of. They were polite but firm. The investigation into Sarah Martinez was to stop immediately, and any information that had been gathered was to be destroyed. Mr. Patterson, one of the agents, said, Ms. Martinez is a decorated veteran whose service to this country cannot be fully disclosed for national security reasons. The fact that she has chosen to live quietly in your community should be viewed as an honor, not a threat. We didn't know, Frank protested. We were just concerned about someone new in town. Now you know, the second agent replied. And now you need to make sure that this harassment stops before it becomes a federal matter. The three women who had started the investigation were gathering that evening at Margaret Thornton's house, ostensibly for their weekly book club, but actually to discuss what they had learned about Sarah Martinez. Each had received information that painted a very different picture of the woman they had confronted. Robert says we need to back off, Margaret said reluctantly. Apparently, she really is military, and not just regular military. Special forces of some kind. Jennifer nodded grimly. David found out the same thing. He says that questions about her are being monitored by federal agencies. We may have gotten ourselves into something we can't handle. Linda was the most shaken of the three. The visit from the federal agents had been terrifying, and she was beginning to realize that their attempt to investigate Sarah had brought unwanted attention from very powerful people. What if we just apologize? Linda suggested. Tell her we made a mistake, and try to smooth things over. Absolutely not, Margaret snapped. We don't apologize to people like that. There has to be another way to handle this. But even as she spoke, Margaret knew that their position was becoming untenable. The federal investigation, the classified background, and the protection that Sarah clearly enjoyed from high levels of government meant that any further harassment would bring consequences they weren't prepared to face. While the three women were planning their next move, Sarah was having a very different kind of evening. Commander Hayes had called her to let her know about the federal intervention in the local investigation. Sarah, I want you to know that we're monitoring the situation, Hayes said. If these people continue to harass you, we can make their lives very complicated very quickly. I appreciate that, Commander, but I was hoping to avoid this kind of attention. I understand, but your service record speaks for itself. You've earned the right to live peacefully, and we're not going to let small-town politics interfere with that. After the call, Sarah sat in her garden, watching the sunset and thinking about the events of the past few days. She had hoped that her confrontation with the three women would be the end of it, but instead, it had triggered a series of investigations that threatened to expose details about her past that she preferred to keep private. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent 20 years protecting national security, often at great personal cost, and now that protection was being extended to her by the same system she had served. The three women who had tried to use their local influence to destroy her were about to learn that there were levels of power and protection far beyond anything they could access through small-town connections. The next morning brought the most dramatic development yet. Emma Torres arrived at Sarah's house early, clearly upset about something she had heard. They're planning something, Emma said as soon as Sarah opened the door. I overheard Mrs. Patterson talking to someone on the phone at the grocery store yesterday. She was saying that they can't let you get away with embarrassing them, even if you do have some kind of government protection. Sarah frowned. She had hoped that the federal intervention would be enough to end the harassment, but apparently, the three women were too proud to accept defeat gracefully. What exactly did she say? Something about going public with the story, making sure everyone in town knows what happened, and putting pressure on you to leave Riverside. She said they have connections with newspapers in the county and maybe even the state. Sarah realized that the situation was about to escalate beyond anything she had anticipated. If the three women decided to go public with their version of the story, it could draw media attention that would completely destroy the quiet life she had tried to build. That afternoon, Sarah received confirmation of her worst fears. David Walsh called her directly, ostensibly to request an interview for a story he was writing about the coffee shop incident. Ms. Martinez, I think the public has a right to know about what happened at Miller's Coffee House. There are questions about who you really are and why you're living in Riverside under such mysterious circumstances. Mr. Walsh, I'm a private citizen who defended a young woman from harassment. That's not much of a story. But your background is a story, Walsh pressed. A former Special Forces soldier living anonymously in a small town, getting into confrontations with prominent citizens. People want to understand what's really happening here. Sarah felt the familiar cold anger that had served her well in combat situations. These people were determined to destroy her privacy and peace, regardless of the consequences to her or anyone else. Mr. Walsh, I strongly advise you to reconsider whatever story you're planning to publish. Some secrets are classified for very good reasons, and some people are protected by laws that you really don't want to violate. Are you threatening me? I'm advising you. There's a difference. But even as Sarah tried to discourage the media attention, she knew that the situation was spinning out of control. The three women who had started this conflict were about to learn some very hard truths about the person they had chosen to target, and the town of Riverside was about to discover that their quiet neighbor had lived a life that none of them could have imagined. The confrontation that had started over a spilled cup of coffee was about to become something much larger and more dangerous. Sarah Martinez had spent 20 years keeping secrets that protected national security, but now those secrets were about to be tested by the determination of three women who refused to accept that they had picked the wrong enemy. The battle for Sarah's privacy and peaceful retirement was entering its most critical phase, and both sides were about to discover that some fights have consequences that extend far beyond what anyone originally intended. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the original coffee shop incident. David Walsh had spent the weekend writing what he believed would be his breakthrough story as an investigative journalist. Despite the warnings he had received about Sarah's classified background, his wife's pressure, and his own ambition had convinced him to move forward with the article. The headline read, "Mystery Woman with Military Past Sparks Controversy in Riverside." The article painted Sarah as a potentially dangerous individual hiding in their peaceful community, questioning why someone with her apparent background would choose to live anonymously among innocent civilians. Walsh had been careful not to include any classified information, but he had pieced together enough public records and speculation to create a story that portrayed Sarah as a threat to the community's safety and peace of mind. He published it in the Riverside Gazette and sent copies to larger regional newspapers, hoping to gain wider attention for his investigative work. What Walsh didn't know was that federal agencies had been monitoring all communications related to Sarah Martinez since the investigation began. Within 30 minutes of the article's publication, his phone was ringing with a call that would change his understanding of the situation completely. Mr. Walsh, this is Deputy Director Janet Morrison from the Department of Defense Office of Strategic Information. We need to discuss the article you published this morning. Walsh felt his confidence evaporate. A deputy director from the DoD was far above the level of attention he had expected his small-town newspaper article to receive. "Ma'am, I published only publicly available information. I was very careful not to include anything classified." "Mr. Walsh, you published speculation and innuendo about a decorated veteran whose service record includes missions that saved thousands of American lives. You've also potentially endangered her safety by drawing unwanted attention to her location and identity." "I didn't know the details of her service," Walsh protested. "That's exactly the point," Morrison replied coldly. "You didn't know, but you published anyway. Do you have any idea what Navy SEALs do, Mr. Walsh? Do you understand the kind of enemy someone in MS Martinez's position might have made during 20 years of classified operations?" The implication hit Walsh like a physical blow. By publishing Sarah's location and drawing attention to her identity. He might have exposed her to retaliation from foreign agents, terrorists, or other enemies of the United States. What do you want me to do? Walsh asked, his voice now shaky. First, you're going to publish a retraction and apology. Second, you're going to provide us with a list of everyone you've contacted about this story and every organization that received copies of your article. And third, you're going to pray that your irresponsible journalism hasn't put a national hero in danger. Meanwhile, Sarah was dealing with the immediate consequences of the article's publication. Her phone had been ringing all morning with calls from reporters who had picked up the story from the wire services that Walsh had contacted. Her quiet life in Riverside was officially over. But the most serious consequence came in the form of a visit from her former commanding officer, Captain James Mitchell, who drove up from Norfolk Naval Base as soon as he learned about the media attention. "Sarah, we have a problem," Mitchell said as soon as he arrived at her house. "The article has been picked up by international media outlets. Your location is now known to people who have very good reasons to want you dead." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. During her years in the SEALs, she had participated in operations that had eliminated high-value targets in terrorist organizations around the world. Many of those organizations had long memories and significant resources. "How bad is it, Captain?" "Bad enough that we're recommending immediate relocation under federal protection. The intelligence community is tracking at least 3 separate threats that have emerged since your identity and location became public." The peaceful retirement that Sarah had worked so hard to build was crumbling around her. The 3 women who had started this chain of events by attacking Emma Torres had no idea that their petty vindictiveness had potentially put a decorated veteran in mortal danger. That afternoon, the federal response to the situation became visible to the entire town of Riverside. Black SUVs with government plates appeared on Elm Street. Federal agents in body armor took positions around Sarah's house. The quiet residential neighborhood suddenly looked like a scene from an action movie. Margaret Thornton, Jennifer Walsh, and Linda Patterson watched the federal response from Margaret's living room window, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. The woman they had tried to drive out of town was under federal protection, surrounded by agents who were prepared to defend her with their lives. "Maybe we should have listened when they told us to back off," Linda said quietly, her face pale as she watched the armed agents setting up a perimeter. "This is insane," Jennifer replied. "She's one person. How can one person be this important?" Margaret remained silent, but her mind was racing. The federal response was so overwhelming that it suggested Sarah's importance to national security was far beyond anything they had imagined. They had picked a fight with someone who was literally under the protection of the United States government. That evening, Sarah received visitors who would help the town understand exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. Captain Mitchell had arranged for some of Sarah's former teammates to come to Riverside, both to provide additional security and to set the record straight about her service. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Johnson had served with Sarah on dozens of missions over the years. He was a decorated SEAL himself, but even he spoke of Sarah with the kind of respect usually reserved for legends. "Most people have no idea what this woman has done for our country," Johnson told the crowd of reporters and townspeople who had gathered outside Sarah's house. "She's been involved in operations that you'll never hear about. Missions that prevented terrorist attacks on American soil and saved countless lives around the world." Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Torres, another former teammate, added, "Sarah Martinez is one of the finest warriors I've ever served with. She's someone who has sacrificed everything for her country and asked for nothing in return except the chance to live peacefully when her service was done." The testimony from Sarah's former teammates painted a picture of heroism that was almost impossible to comprehend. Stories of hostage rescues, counterterrorism operations, and classified missions that had prevented international incidents began to emerge. Emma Torres, who had been following the news coverage with growing amazement, finally understood why Sarah had seemed so different from other people. The woman who had defended her in the coffee shop was a genuine American hero, someone whose courage and skill had protected the entire country. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah herself finally spoke to the media. Standing on her front porch, surrounded by federal agents and former teammates, she addressed the crowd that had gathered. "I came to Riverside because I wanted to live a quiet life after 20 years of service," Sarah began. "I never wanted attention or recognition. I just wanted to be a good neighbor and maybe make some friends." She looked directly at the cameras as she continued. "Last week, I saw a young woman being humiliated by people who thought their social status gave them the right to hurt others. I couldn't stand by and watch that happen, not after spending my career protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The three women who started the situation made choices based on cruelty and prejudice. They attacked someone because of her background and economic status. That kind of behavior is exactly what I spent 20 years fighting against around the world. Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. I don't regret defending Emma Torres. I would do it again tomorrow. But I deeply regret that this town has been disrupted because some people couldn't accept being challenged on their behavior. The impact of Sarah's words was immediate and profound. The crowd of townspeople who had come to gawk at the federal agents and military personnel began to see the situation in a completely different light. This wasn't about a mysterious stranger causing trouble. It was about a decorated veteran who had defended an innocent young woman from bullies. Over the next several days, the truth about Margaret Thornton, Jennifer Walsh, and Linda Patterson's behavior began to spread throughout Riverside. The story of how they had attacked Emma Torres and then used their influence to try to destroy Sarah when she defended the young woman sparked outrage throughout the community. Local businesses began refusing service to the three women. Their social circle evaporated as people realized they wanted no association with individuals who would attack a veteran for defending a student. The power and influence they had wielded for years suddenly meant nothing in the face of public disgust at their behavior. David Walsh found himself facing professional consequences as well. The newspaper's board of directors forced him to resign after learning about his reckless journalism and the federal investigation it had triggered. His career as a journalist was effectively over. Detective Mike Reynolds, who had been pressured into investigating Sarah, publicly apologized for his role in harassing a decorated veteran. The police department announced new policies to prevent politically motivated investigations in the future. But the most important change came in the community's relationship with Emma Torres. The young woman who had been humiliated in the coffee shop suddenly found herself embraced by a town that was eager to make amends for how she had been treated. Local businesses offered her scholarships and internships. Community members who had witnessed her humiliation but done nothing to help came forward to apologize and offer support. Emma's dream of becoming a nurse was no longer just a hope. It was now supported by an entire community that wanted to prove they were better than the three women who had attacked her. As for Sarah, the federal protection gradually diminished as the immediate threats were neutralized. But her life in Riverside was permanently changed. Instead of being an anonymous neighbor, she was now a celebrated local hero whose service was honored throughout the community. The house on Elm Street became a gathering place for local veterans and their families. Sarah found herself mentoring young people who were considering military service and counseling veterans who were struggling with their transition to civilian life. Margaret Thornton, Jennifer Walsh, and Linda Patterson eventually left Riverside, their reputations destroyed and their influence gone. The town they had once dominated wanted nothing to do with them after learning what they were truly capable of when their authority was challenged. In the end, Sarah Martinez got something she hadn't expected when she moved to Riverside. Not just peace and anonymity, but a community that understood and appreciated her service. The coffee shop incident that had disrupted her quiet life ultimately led to something better. A home where she was known, respected, and valued for who she really was. Emma Torres graduated from nursing school with honors, supported by a community scholarship fund that had been established in her name. She often said that the worst moment of her life, being humiliated in that coffee shop, had led to the best things that had ever happened to her. And in Miller's Coffee House, where the whole situation had started, a small plaque was installed near the corner booth where Sarah used to sit, in honor of all who serve and all who stand up for others. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary places become the setting for extraordinary acts of courage, and that real heroes can be found in the most unexpected places.